We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent, and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west, to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation, and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nioni peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
Well, hello and welcome to this session, Margaret River, Cabernet Sauvignon. The subtitle here is Traditional, Sustainable and Organic Practices. So I'm Jamie Good, wine journalist. I'm going to be introducing this session, but most of the content is going to be coming from our three participants from the region itself. We have Glenn Goodall from Xanadu, we have Jimmy Penton from Voyager Estate, and Bart Molony from Vasse Felix. And just a quick note, we were supposed to have Alex Miller from Voyager Estate, but she's unfortunately got COVID. So Jimmy is the assistant winemaker. He's going to be taking her place. And his biography is present in the section on the screen labeled handouts, if you want background to Jimmy. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got an hour for this session. What that means is we're going to be trying to condense quite a lot into it. For the lucky few who've got wines, we'll be tasting the wines as well and talking about the wines in context of the other things we're discussing. And this is kind of conversational. So the idea is that we're going to be having, more or less a conversation rather than presentations. And for that reason, if you've got any comments you want to make or there's any questions you want to ask, then drop them into the Q&A section at the right of your screens, and we'll feed those in as we go along, unless, of course, you say something really terrible, in which case we'll just ignore it. First of all, I'd just like to kick off by asking Glenn Goodall to make an introduction for us.
Jamie, I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Wadani people of the region as the traditional custodians of the land, and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you, Glenn. One of the focuses of this session, one of the kind of things that we're looking to tease out as we taste the wines, is this issue of sustainability and organic and biodynamic practices as well, with a focus on viticulture, because there's been quite a revolution in the region. And in fact, there are, I think, 720 hectares of the region's 5,000 hectares that are farmed organically, which is 12.3% of the vineyard area. And now that's quite high. In terms of global context, that's a really high percentage. And all the wineries here are part of the Sustainable Wine Australia scheme. So Glenn, could you just say a little bit about that, what that means? What's the background to Sustainable Wine Australia?
Yeah, well, sustainable. There's a great groundswell in Australia at the moment, and certainly in Margaret River with respect to sustainability. And I guess all of the wines that we'll be looking at today represent different approaches to that. Some, as you said, are Sustainable Wine Growing Australia certified, and that's a nationally recognised certification, which is a combination of Wine Australia, AGWA and Australian Wine Research Institute, about sustainable practices and looking at benchmarking yourselves against not just where you were last year, but against the rest of the region and against the rest of the country to make sure that you're constantly improving. We've also got wines here that are grown organically and wines that are biodynamically grown. So collectively, there's just different ways and different sustainable journeys that is becoming more and more of a groundswell in Margaret River.
Great. So a little bit of background then to the region. First of all, location. We're in the southwest corner of Australia, and this is quite a remote region. Would you agree, Jimmy?
Yeah, definitely. I think Australia, Perth is one of the most isolated capital cities in the world, and we're still 3.5 hours from there. And I think that's one of the benefits of the region is the climatic conditions we get on the very bottom southwest corner of the country with dry summers, lots of water in winter, and beautiful sort of air conditioning breezes, keeping the region nice and cool.
Because you're pretty close to the sea, I guess. This is the intersection of the Indian and Southern Oceans, right? This bottom corner. So yeah, that must be quite an appeal to the region. The fact that you can hit the beaches very quickly after finishing work.
Yeah, it's very good, and you can sleep at night in summer quite comfortably, most of the time with a blanket. So we do have these beautiful, cool nights throughout summer. And I think everyone here would agree that adds to some of the uniqueness of this area, and it definitely the grapes benefit from that.
Yeah. So some more facts and figures. This is really quite a boutique region. Margaret River accounts for 2% of Australia's crush. There's 5,840 hectares of vines, which is not huge, spread among around 200 producers. But the history, I think, is really interesting because it's quite a new region. The first vines planted in 1967, which is a cracking year. It's my birth year. And just by way of comparison, that's kind of similar to Willamette Valley in Oregon, which I think was in 65. The first vines went in there. And I guess Marlborough in New Zealand as well was 73. The first vines went in there. So there's a kind of flurry of new wine regions emerging. And the history here is interesting because I guess there's two people who need a mention here. First of all is the famous University of California Davis professor, Harold Olmo, who visited the region in 1955. He spent 8 months in Western Australia studying issues with the Swan Valley wine industry. So Swan Valley is quite a warm climate region near to Perth. And in 1956, he published a report mentioning that the cool southern areas in Western Australia might be really quite suitable for making these European-style table wines using climate analogy. And this led to some experimental plantings and then commercial plantings in Mount Barker, Forest Hill. But the person who really spotted the potential of Margaret River was John Gladstone's, who's written quite an interesting book. This is the first book he wrote, Viticulture and Environment. I was given that in 2006 by Brian Crozer, who was a big believer in Gladstone's. Well, Gladstone's was a lupin breeder, and Jack Mann at Hohnen gave him some space, I think a hectare of the vineyard that wasn't being used for his experiments. And then in 1960, Gladstone's joined the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Western Australia, and he was teaching horticulture and climatology. And he carried on the sort of the brief that Olmo had made, that this kind of southern end of the state might be really interesting for viticulture. And using these climate analogies, he identified Margaret River as being very similar in climate to Bordeaux, but with less spring frost, more reliable sunshine, and generally, just a really interesting place for growing Bordeaux varieties. And it wasn't long before people started planting. I think Gladstone's reports came out in 65 and 66. And then we had 1967, we had Vasse Felix putting vines into the ground, Tom Cullity, Mosswood, Bill Pennell in 69, Cape Mentelle, David Hohnen in 1970, and then the Cullens, Kevin and Dye, planted in 1971. So this was kind of the start of the region. And it's led to some very interesting wines. And it's really fascinating, I think, from my perspective, to see a kind of a wine region emerge from nothing. And so let's focus more on Cabernet Sauvignon before we get to the wines. Bart, I wanted to ask you a question. There's some kind of interesting stuff about Cabernet Sauvignon clones. And there's a very interesting heritage clone, which is known as Hohnen or SA126. Can you tell us a story about this?
Yeah, I'll do my best. There's a bit of sort of darkness or not everything's known how it got here, but one of the hypotheses is that it came here on a ship from South Africa. It's just not known whether that ship came from Europe to South Africa with the cuttings on board and then to Margaret River. And that happened around about somewhere between 1836 and 1895. And they were planted out in the Swan Valley. So that happened, what we think is before phylloxera had cleaned out a lot of Europe. So when we talk about heritage clone, it's like an heirloom sort of plant stock, I guess. And so at the time when, Tom Cullity wanted to plant the grapes at Vasse Felix, he had to go to the Hohnen Vineyard to get the material off Jack. And he took what was called a mass selection out of the old vineyard there, brought it to Vasse Felix and planted it there. And in the meantime, prior to that, there'd been a trial block planted down at Forest Hill with the same material. So I guess that was what we commonly known as mass selection Hohnen clone. And since then, there's been a number of vine improvement selections that have happened with that clone since it first was planted in WA. So there's a few different sort of selections getting around at the moment. But yeah, a lot of the old vineyards would be the mass selection, and that would have maybe more variability in the vines, a bit more hen and chicken in some of the grapes. Some vines might not produce much fruit. So there seems to be a bit more genetic variability in there. But yeah, the big thing that's really sort of not happened in WA is that we've had these very strict quarantine laws over the years, which has prevented the movement of plant material in and out of the state, or more into the state. So I've had to work with what we had, I guess. And particularly around the time when vineyards started to proliferate throughout the state, those quarantine laws were quite strict.
Yeah. So Glenn, the fact that you've had this quarantine and biosecurity presumably means you don't have any phylloxera in Western Australia. Does that mean that there are a lot of vineyards planted on their own roots, or do people still use grafted vines?
Yeah, most of Margaret River's it's on its own roots. It wasn't until 20 years ago we even had downy mildew in Margaret River, although it was around on the eastern states. But certainly while there was a big growth in the 90s, there was some quarantine process that went through, and SA126, which is another clone which was widely planted in Margaret River, came in then. Although I think over the years that was probably come in more so from a yield perspective, whereas I think we've fallen back on these heirloom clones, these heritage clones such as Hohnen, and as Bart mentioned, it's a mass selection, and we're sort of drilling down on that with tastings variously going down to the individual vines, mother vines that are responsible for that clone. But interestingly, the characteristics between the two are quite often the Hohnen clone it's got this lovely ductile, malleable tannins, and the SA126 tends to be a little bit more angular and can certainly throw a little bit more of a bigger crop than the Hohnen stuff.
Just to put it in perspective, I think it's about a 9-year period to bring a cutting material into the state and go through all the testing by the Agricultural Department of the state. So it's basically a decade-long ambition to trial new clones, let alone see the results of those clones.
Yeah. Do you have any virus? Do you have any leaf roll virus in Margaret River?
Yep. Yeah. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing now, particularly on our own vineyard in SA126. We're finding some of the virus there. So so we're looking at replanting, looking at other clones as well as these heritage clones such as Hohnen, which we sort of hang our hat on. But given that so much of our fruit in the region is on its own roots, I think West Australia's got a little bit to learn too with respect to the pros and cons of using different rootstocks in what is a drying climate as well. And I guess that all plays into the sustainability aspect of growing fruit in Margaret River.
I guess also that if you've got some old blocks you like the look of them, and you can make your own muscle selections because you don't need to graft it. Presumably it's much cheaper than if you want to plant. You could even do it yourself, couldn't you, presumably?
Yeah, and that's something that's definitely going on. Especially, we've started a project like that where our old 78 plant in Cabernet, we're regenerating that whole vineyard to maintain an average age of those vines, and we've taken those cuttings from a selection of 3 vines that were selected throughout 3 seasons and consecutive individual vine ferments of 10 plus vines every year to come down to those 3. So really trying to build a heritage clone for our property, let alone the region. So there's a lot of expansion to be found in that area.
So, Bart, there's a question you mentioned about the cool nights, proximity to sea with cool nights. Brad Horn's asked a question in the Q&A. He says, what do these cool nights do to the grape growing, in your opinion?
I think, well, they extend the growing period to a degree. Particularly with Cabernet, that's important for tannin ripeness and getting the skins right. But the cool nights and that diurnal variation, and I think, Glenn, you back me up here, helps to retain acid in the grapes. So they come in with, in good years with naturally high acid. So in terms of winemaking, that's beneficial because you're not having to manipulate that in the winery. And I guess that's a big advantage. Also, it gives, if you have a hot day, it gives the vines 12 hours to recover. And they wake up in the morning and they're ready to go again. And so I think that also helps with physiologically the vines being able to recover from having transpired during the day if you're experiencing warm weather.
Yeah, Jimmy, climate in the region. Why is it so well suited to Cabernet Sauvignon?
I think it's a lot to do with the lack of summer rainfall and really the length of our season. And I think Bart touched on it slightly there, is those cool nights allow us to really hang Cabernet for an extended period without having any pressures from disease. And the fact that we don't get that summer rainfall. So I think that longevity of the season, the cool nights, and there's something to do with the intensity of the sun down here. It's maybe not the hottest region temperature-wise, but there is a real intensity of the sun. And the theory with that is probably the thinner atmosphere down on this southern part of Australia. And yeah, it's amazing how much more you'll get burnt down here, even compared to 3 hours north in Perth, which temperature-wise would be dramatically hotter. But the sun has a real intensity on this southwest corner.
Does that have implications for how you manage the fruit zone in terms of whether you remove leaves or which side you remove leaves from or when you do it? What's the best practice there?
Oh, I reckon Bart's probably a good one for that.
I think the approach is don't overcommit either way. Particularly, some years. There's a real art to that, and it's a decision that, as a vineyard viticulturist in a relatively large winery, I wouldn't make that on my own. So that is what I consider in viticulture. We're making wine, so we make that decision collectively, and that's about just getting everyone's opinion, and also about just having the ability to hedge your bets on that one. So, you don't want to overexpose the fruit in case you get heat and it gets burnt. You don't want to underexpose the fruit and not achieve optimal ripeness. And somewhere in there, Glenn, there's a,
Yeah, I sort of try and read the tea leaves as well. Like when you look at the phenology and you can see where you're at with, relative to what your normal, whether it be bud burst, flowering, fruit set sort of periods, that's pretty much a pretty good barometer on how much leaf you want to take off. For example, we've got east-west rows as well as north-south rows. East-west, we tend to go sprawl canopy, so there's a lot of dappled light, and particularly for with the length of our season being quite a long growing season, you certainly find that the sun is very much in the northern hemisphere, and it's a lot harder to manage on those east-west rows. But if you if you can take advantage of that in some ways, or acknowledge that when you're doing your canopy management, you come up with the goods. And that long growing season, we still get plenty of sunshine hours, but being so maritime, having that lovely consistent sea breeze coming through and cooling everything down is a really important thing to be able to hang fruit to get full physiological ripeness but maintain freshness, such as the cool nights and so on as well. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of Margaret River Cabernet, is maintaining that freshness, which is that regional thumbprint and regional integrity that is Margaret River in a glass.
Yeah, you mentioned the sprawl. So is this the single wire where you have the canopy kind of just sprawling and over the the kind of falling down? I've seen a bit of that in Barossa as well.
Yeah, it's probably more done over eastern here. I think a lot of people are VSP, vertical shoot positioning, but sprawl is setting the wires and then basically allowing like an afro kind of habit in the canopy. And by doing that, you often have a lot of dappled light as the sun's moving around, as opposed to strict VSP. When you strict VSP, you've got a lot of control, but it also you can overcommit. If you're going to leaf pluck everything, it means you're leaving things exposed. And, so there's plenty of ways to skin a cat. And we're finding that we're doing a lot of sprawl on east-west and VSP on north-south because we've got more control.
Yeah, and I guess the general rule is, if you're on north-south, which is probably majority of more recent plantings, open up morning light and leave leaf on your afternoon side to really protect from that intensity of that afternoon sun.
Yeah, the afternoon sun is a killer. But yeah, I think the other thing that's happening, broadly with Margaret River is, we're maturing as a region, and a lot of these decisions that we have to make, as Glenn said, we look at phenology, we look at the growing season, the dates, but a lot of it comes back to almost like institutional knowledge within each winery. And Glenn's been there 23 years. You've been around for 15, 18 years. We're starting to build up a bank of knowledge, and that knowledge is shared. And I think, as I was saying before, you have to make big decisions. Sometimes you ring a neighbour or you ring someone else and you'll invite some opinion into the room and just get some reassurance that what you're doing is not crazy or the wrong thing. But yeah, I think it's a sign of the region maturing.
Yeah, I reckon that's a really great point. When you look at a region that's only been around in a commercial sense for 50 years, if you look at what we were making in the 70s and 80s, and some of the wines that put Margaret River on the map from Cape Mentelle in the early 80s were Jimmy Watson winners, were picked at sort of 12.5 Beaumet, and that was what was in vogue at the time, and probably a lot more herbaceous characters than now. And I know Dave Hohnen mentioned that he saw a big turning point in Margaret River in the mid-90s when bird nets became a lot more affordable. Often those vines were picked early to avoid bird pressure. Once we had bird nets, we were able to hang vines a bit longer. So if you look at the evolution of Margaret River's wines from those sort of more herbaceous notes in the say 70s and 80s through to much more bold, riper styles in the mid-90s, I think we're in a really comfortable place now where we're a lot more comfortable in our skin. And Vasse Felix hosts a fantastic annual get-together where we all come and show one another our wines with some technical data, warts and all, and actually have a discussion. And it's really great and collegiate learning environment so that we're kind of pushing each other to get better all of the time.
So you mentioned ripeness, and this is an interesting question because I think it's one thing I've seen kind of like in my relatively brief career is that this almost pendulum swing in the mid to late 90s across many regions for picking later and later. And there seems now to be a little swing, a counterbalance to that, which is maybe actually you can pick too late. And some of the wines were big and overblown, too ripe. People were talking about, looking at the seeds going brown, tasting the fruit, and they basically were missing their picks to the point that they needed to correct in the winery. You have to fairly heroic tartaric ads and even adding back water as well in some regions. Has there ever been that sort of pendulum swing in Margaret River? Because one of the other things, I guess, is that when we're dealing with Cabernet Sauvignon, that green is a part of its flavour spectrum. ripe Cabernet Sauvignon often has a little green edge, and same with Merlot and Cabernet Franc. And some winemakers, I think, in the past have been scared of green. What's the situation in Margaret River? Have you seen a gradual move towards increasing ripeness and then just staying there, or has there been a kind of a move backwards slightly in style?
I think probably in the late 90s there was a push, and that was it's driven by style and various critics as well. Whereas I think now there's a much more comfortable diversity is fantastic, and I think that people being more comfortable in producing wines that are absolutely showing varietal and regional integrity. And when you talk of herbaceousness or green, there's various shades of that, whether it's, there's one thing to say celery and tomato leaf, there's another thing for these lovely ripe Mediterranean herbs and bay and olive and so on. So I think now there's probably as much diversity now as we've ever had in the last 50 years. But I think that people are, absolutely trying to make sure that the regional and varietal integrity is what's the strongest attribute in the wines, rather than pushing them to have a generic big sort of style. So I would say that everyone here is trying to make fresher, more food friendly, elegant sort of styles these days relative to say 15, 20 years ago.
And Jimmy, question about sub-regionality. So from the outside, we think of Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon, but once you're in the region, do people talk a lot more about the influence of the different sub-regions? And if so, I know this is a slightly leading question, is that because of slight microclimatic differences, or is it soil type differences?
It's definitely a bit of both, but in terms of the region, it's quite long north to south and quite skinny east to west. So we see that variability. As a general rule, it's warmer in the northern bit and becomes cooler as you move south. Every part has that beautiful coastal influence because they're all along the coast. But I think in terms of sub-regional, I think it goes to what we've just spoken about as well, is the understanding of the region and language and tastings around how we talk about sub-regions have probably been going on for a good close to 10 years now, much more collaboratory. And I think now we're really understanding the nuances and the differences. And from my personal experience, when I started with Voyager, we took fruit from multiple sub-regions of the region, and now we've purely gone back to off our own site, and that's purely just based on having full control over everything on our site. But the slight nuances and variabilities really add to the complexities of the region, and some of it might be market driven to an extent, but there's certainly pockets. And I think it's soil. The differences is the variability in soil, not the differences between sub-regions. It's probably the differences within vineyards, not sub-regions. So we either have really generally great draining gravel or grey sand or heavy clay, and generally you'll have all of those on your property. So it's about planting and selecting the right vineyard sites within your property and within your sub-region as well.
Yeah, one of the questions in the Q&A is from Christine, says, what makes the ironstone gravel so wonderful for Cabernet Sauvignon? And I guess the extension is the ironstone gravel soil the optimal for the Cabernet Sauvignon, or can you also plant it on the other soil types as well?
I think those gravels, just those free draining soils are the key. When you're on some heavier soils, particularly clays, where there's a lot more water retention, you can tend to get a little bit too much vigor, and Cabernet can be quite a vigorous variety. I think there's a scope, as Jimmy sort of mentioned. Margaret River is actually a mosaic of soil types in all of the sub-regions, and it's like trying to marry the right varieties to the right soil types. And it's quite interesting is that when you look at the endemic species around here, if you look at Marri, which is the red gum that flower during harvest and keep the birds away from our fruit, they tend to be on these lovely free draining gravelly loams, whereas Jarrah tends to be on some of the more sandier sort of soils, and Carry, might be on some more of these sort of clay soils. So it's interesting, just even just looking at the natural fauna and flora, for flora around the place, that's always been a good indication of what has been good vineyard country.
And it's as far as that ironstone, gravel, laterite soil goes, Glenn's right. Cabernet Sauvignon is a wild horse, and it needs to be restrained. Not necessarily stressed. I think if you stress it too much, then you don't get a good result. When I look at a really good ironstone soil, I look for something with a bit of loam in it, not sandy, not a gravel sand, but a gravel loam. The gravel sands can be too harsh, can stress them, and you end up sort of almost overshooting the end point.
Yeah, totally.
I'm well aware that we've got some wines to taste as well. So before we go straight to the wine, but just following on from that, there's one quick question in the Q&A, which is from Miguel. And do you need to irrigate?
Certainly in vineyard establishment, I like a lot of the founding wineries did it hard, and they were dry grown, and there's still certainly some very, very good dry grown vineyards around. It's lovely to have the option, to be honest, so that in years when you've got some heat pressure, but it's not necessarily necessary. It's certainly helpful with establishment though.
Yeah, I think it gets back to what Jimmy was saying with, on a certain property, you'll have every different soil type. On some of those, you will never have to irrigate on them. On others, you will have to, and maybe they're not your Grand Cru plots. I don't know, but it just depends, on that, where that soil is, what type of soil it is. And if you find the best soils, what I would call the best Cabernet soils, I don't think you would have to irrigate.
Great. So let's go to the first wine. I believe that this is yours, Glenn, the Xanadu.
Yep. So
can you introduce it first?
Sure. So Xanadu was established in 1977, so one of the earlier wineries. This Cabernet is a blend from our own fruit and from various growers throughout the region, Willie Abrupt, Treaton. I guess it's a case of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, where most of this is Hohnen clone. The 2019 was actually a really, really cool vintage. So when we put these blends together, we're looking at, I kind of see the north-south spectrum very, very generally as being much more for Cabernet, much more blue fruited in the north, moving down through sort of black fruits down to sort of plummy, and then red fruits and red currants sort of as you head further south. So big generalisation, but I think that's where in cooler years we tend to look more towards sort of Willie Abrupt and some of those more northern areas for our black label, our premium Cabernet, and also the use of, in this case, Malbec and Petit Verdot, which supplement that, and looking at some of the tech notes of some of these wines. Malbec, PV, Merlot, and Cab Franc, to a lesser extent, have always been a big part of Cabernet blends. Certainly from a Xanadu perspective, we're putting a little bit more emphasis on Malbec and PV being the sort of salt and pepper, I guess, as long as Cabernet is still the loudest voice in the glass.
Yeah. People have often said about Australian Cabernet Sauvignon in general, that there's a slightly mid-palate hole, and that's often why there's other grapes are blended in just to fill that mid-palate hole. And I noticed that all these wines, apart from one, the McHenry Hohnen, none of them are 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. Is that something that's very widespread, and adding other varieties to just balance out Cabernet?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking at still Cabernet needs to be the hero, and I don't think that necessarily Margaret River Cabernet has that same sort of hole. I think some of these straight Cabernets, one of our other best Cabernets is from Stevens Road, is 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, but I think particularly in years where you've, like 2019 been a little bit cooler, trying to get some of those more lifted characteristics as florals from the Petit Verdot and tannin structure. I think that at the end of the day, use the tools that you've got to put the best wine together. And if you don't need to use Mel or any Shiraz for that matter, I think Margaret Cabernet by itself can produce a very good wine.
And regarding sustainability, what's your
well,
position?
I guess in the scheme of these wines here, Xanadu, Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, I talked a little bit about before, is a nationally recognised sustainability program. Xanadu is the first winery in the West Australia to wear the Sustainability Trust mark. It doesn't, however, mean that we are growing organically or biodynamically. That's not to say that organics and biodynamics aren't extremely sustainable or can be very sustainable practices, but it's, I guess, a stepping stone by looking at how we grow our grapes and just environmental stewardship through soil care, water usage, energy usage as well. So it's more than just how we're growing the grapes. It's a holistic approach to how we're actually making the wines.
And it also provides a great transparency for the consumer.
Yep. I guess the fact that every one of these wines here, whatever sustainability program they're on, they're all certified. So they're all independently audited. So it's with a bit of confidence when consumers can taste these wines, know that they've been independently audited.
And it's the SWA program is quite, as James said, transparent, but it also has a series of metrics that you can actually measure your own performance.
Yep.
Very practical, and they just make sense. Yeah. So
and there's a winery side of it as well, yeah. So there's the Vineyard certification plus winery certification. That's quite important as well, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. So the winery needs to be certified SWA or Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, but also in order to use the trust mark, at least it's the same as our blending label integrity rules. At least 85% of the fruit also needs to be certified. So the growers are certified as well. So it's really good, from a Xanadu perspective to, most of our growers are on board now so that we can actually achieve that. But it's a lot easier in the case of single vineyards and, proprietary producers such as, Voyager. There we go.
So has there been much chat in the region about this sort of newcomer, which is regenerative viticulture, this approach that tries to look at, I guess, getting the ecosystem of the vineyard working so that fewer inputs are needed? Is that something that's being talked about at all, Bart?
Yes, very much so. When we embarked on our journey, we wanted a better farming system, and we didn't start with organics. That's where we ended up. But a lot of it was about, how do we make sure we're going to be here in 100 years' time? I've had to unlearn a lot of things and relearn a lot of things through that journey. And our journey wasn't one of substitution. So we didn't take what we were doing conventionally and find a whole heap of other organic solutions to those problems. We had to look deeper. And part of that was, we need to look after the soil. So, we soil test every couple of years. But basically, we're looking at high-level things that are happening in our soil, almost like checking the pulse, checking the blood pressure. If the pulse is the pH, the blood pressure is your carbon levels, your heart rate is your nitrogen levels. And then on top of that, looking at the biological health of the soil and the structural health of the soil. So once you sort of look at that and you go, that's our aim, that's what we need to do, the rest of the process sort of falls into place. And you can almost build a decision-making tree about what you do in a vineyard based on what you're trying to achieve with your vines and your soil. And often you'll get to the bottom of that tree and you'll say, do nothing. Or, the problem that you're trying to fight is not worth fighting, or your solution is out of proportion to the problem. So it creates thought and care about what you do based on being here in 100 years' time.
Yeah, I like the sound of that because it isn't a recipe. It's about this is where we want to get to. It's results driven, and so the toolkit is what you have to use. It's specific to your region to get to that sort of result, and rather than just saying, well, this is some recipe that someone cooked up for how to run vineyards, and it's being applied across vastly different regions across the world, maybe not so successfully. But I like the sound of that one. So what are the major challenges that you're facing in the vineyard? I mean, is climate chaos something that's hitting you guys like everywhere else in the world? Have you got a warming trend in terms of the vineyards that you've got to face?
No. We have no reason to complain as far as the climate goes here.
We're finding a drying trend rather than a warming trend, so it's probably a little bit more manageable in terms of that resource, in terms of our vineyard that we got planted in the ground, rather than having to jump around to different varieties or something like that at this stage.
Yeah, and that's sort of based across, when you look at the data across Australia, there are certainly many areas that are experiencing both drying and warming, but we've been relatively protected from the warming trend, although 2022 was reasonably warm, but there's no doubt we're in a drying environment.
Great. So back to that wine.
It's important we plant the best ground, and we know that in 20 years' time, if it's drying out, we need to plant the grapes over here and not over here, and or we need to embrace rootstocks, and so we do have to keep our eye on the horizon.
Glenn, just saying that there's a lot of freshness in that wine, nice structure and freshness. Do you have to acidify at all, or is that just natural acid from the grapes?
No, I will acidify that wine, to be honest. So I'll bring it in, and when we put more so to combat any potential Brettanomyces issues. So we're quite conscious of making sure that the wine has got a relatively stable pH, like generally under 3.6. But other than that, and I do think that helps to maintain that freshness of the wine as well. And generally also having maintaining relatively high sulfur dioxide levels while it's maturing, just to maintain that freshness to the wine. It is the youngest wine in the lineup as well.
Right, so let's move to wine number 2. Jimmy, this is yours.
Yes, thank you. So this is our Voyager Estate 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon. This was our first year of the vines being under certification. So, it was a pretty big milestone for us at Voyager. That wasn't not full certification under, what's the word? I've lost it. No, under conversion, sorry. And so for us, our vineyards, as I stated before, the property was established in 78, the original plantings. Voyager was established in 1990. And this particular wine comes off our old vineyard, the 78 planting Cabernet, and one of our more newer vineyards, which was in 95, both to the Hohnen clone, with the old block being the Massal selection and the new block being a bit more targeted selection in that. For us, I guess the wine, this was a journey. I guess the organics, like Bart said, came as a journey from starting with SWA as a pilot program back in, I think, 2009, through to where we are now with organics and now international wineries for climate action, being a part of that. It's been a massive journey for Voyager, and I think this wine and what we're seeing is just this greater degree of textures in the wine and complexities. And for us, dominant Cabernet, all hand-picked, meticulously fruit sorted. We don't try and crush too many berries in the processing. We want that real whole berry aspect, because we can get quite heavy tannins in Margaret River, and just controlling the extraction, low temperature. And I think the key that's been brought up a couple of times in that first wine for Margaret River Cabernet is that vibrancy and freshness and perfume. And I think when you see that slight little floral lift in Margaret River Cabernet, which I think you almost see in every single one of these wines, it's we know that's a really good year. So quite excited, especially for the 18s, but 16, 17, 18, 19, all pretty sensational years.
Yeah, we've had a pretty good run.
Had a couple of questions in the chat, just wanted to bring them out. One from Tracy, she says, Australian Cabernet has a reputation for an essence of eucalyptus. Does Margaret River showcase this as well. So yeah, just for those who don't realise this, that if you're making if you've got vineyards close to eucalyptus trees, the latest theory is that you get leaves in the picking bins that create that cineole character, slightly minty cineole character in the wines. Is that something that's a characteristic of Margaret River?
I think it's vineyard specific, to be honest. I think certainly some of our grower vineyards can come across with those sort of eucalypt, sort of choc mint sort of characteristics. It's not something that we chase, but it's not something that we shy away from, provided at the end of the day, as long as there's enough fruit and that eucalypt isn't dominating.
It's an interesting discussion in terms of native eucalypts to Margaret River don't generally give the oils out into the vineyard onto the leaf and the fruit like some of our non-native West Australian species, like blue gums, which were traditionally a fast-growing eucalypt, which were planted in tree lines for windbreaks. We soon realised that, and most of those got pulled out. So that was the strongest influence for us of that eucalypt cineole character. But I think as a regional stamp, we have very much that more dried bay leaf sort of character as a regional characteristic.
And Jane Parkinson asked a question. She says, have the wine flavour profiles changed since you signed up to Sustainable Wine Australia and followed whatever requirements were expected for certification? And I guess, Jimmy, you answered that. You said when you moved to organics that you found there was a change in the flavour of the wines.
I guess Sustainable Wine Growing Australia probably hasn't had that influence because it's much more of a sort of reporting system where we can get all the data and feedback from our friends next door and in the region and from every other region in the country, and have a plan of continuous improvement for all sustainable efficiencies within the business, whether that be water use, power use or something like that. Whereas organics and people who've gone to the biodynamic side and just general, more biological viticulture, it's forced us to do different things in the vineyard, on the soil floor, and it's forced us to learn more things about some of the pests and diseases that we were struggling with. And I think that's another good point, is we, being such a tiny region in Australia, and we have so isolated, we have different pests and diseases that affect us compared to the rest of the country. And there's just not that research into the troubleshooting what we can do about that. So we kind of have to work as a region ourselves. And I think that's where the collaboration comes in, and moving to biodynamics and organics, we've really stumbled across techniques that are helping everyone in the region, like reducing weevils and some of our disease pressures. So it's probably more so to viticultural changes due to organics and biodynamics and just general biological based farming.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I've noticed since we've changed our inputs into the vineyard from high analysis fertiliser through to organically allowable inputs. We're using more fish, we're using more seaweed, we're using all these sort of interesting plant tonics. And I think our fruit is stronger physically. It has better shelf life. We pick our Chardonnay and our Cabernet, we put it into bins, we stack the grapes on top of each other, a whole bunch, and they don't juice, not until they're put into the winery. So I think that sort of integrity of the fruit has improved. Has that improved quality? I think in some indirect way, I reckon it has. Yeah. I think the fruit is preserved. Is gonna last longer. Would that be fair? Comment?
I think so, particularly like sort of that kind of rolls into Vasse Felix's wine, with wild fermentation as well, which I think is an extension of the vineyard.
Let's talk about wine number 3 then.
So this is the 2018 Vasse Felix Cabernet Sauvignon. So Virginia, our winemaker, she likes to make wine that is elegant but powerful. And I think that's the direction of our wine has gone over the years. And the direction of our viticulture has supported that in a way. I think, the way that she makes her wine through wild fermentation, experimenting with different aging vessels, processing techniques and whatnot. We have to deliver sound quality grapes to Virginia that are ripe. And it gets back to that whole thing. We're all making wine. At the end of the day, we're all making wine to improve someone's life down the end of the glass. So our commitment has been to support the winemaking in their endeavours. And just on the winemaking itself, one of the things that Vasse Felix has been doing is a slight move away from barriques and looking at larger format vessels. Given that we're importing a lot of air from France, when we bring barrels in, we've got containers full of wood and air. So I think part of that sustainability for us is also not just in the vineyard, it's also looking at interesting new formats for fermenting red wine and storing red wine, whether it's occupestos or eggs or concrete, larger format open fermentation vessels, and vessels that can be used for different things, for storing wine or for fermenting wine. So I guess that's something that started around the time 2018. It's been an evolution, but again, it's just keeping the eye on the horizon and seeing what's coming and being ready for it.
Oh, and I think that's a great example of just thoughtfulness, not just looking at what's happening now or tomorrow in the vineyard, but just having a bit more extension of what you can do from a sustainability perspective as well, and all of that stuff sort of plays into there's some really pretty elegant wines here, and that's notwithstanding that 18 in particular was a stonkingly good vintage. So that whole power and elegance don't need to be mutually exclusive is sort of really personified, I think, here.
Glenn, could you introduce wine number 4 for us?
Sure. So wine number 4 is from the McHenry Hohnen vineyard. So McHenry Hohnen winery, or McHenry Hohnen, was originally founded by David Hohnen and Murray McHenry, both pioneering grape growing families in Margaret River, with Dave setting up Cape Mentelle in the early 70s and Murray planting a vineyard out in Burnside in the late 70s, early 80s. So they sort of joined forces and were supplying grapes to some of those McMurray's grapes were going to Cape Mentelle. They joined forces and in 2004 established the McHenry Hohnen winery and vineyard, and I've got they're sort of southern Margaret River, although they are sourcing fruit from around various sub-regions, including the original Burnside vineyard that Murray was his first planting. In 2017, 2018, sort of Dave Hohnen retired from that enterprise, and now that's, I guess, Murray McHenry sort of baby, with Japo Delicani at the helm, driving the winemaking there. They began on a biodynamic journey when Mike Sleegers was the viticulturist there, and they did their first, and he was there after he'd come back from the US. I think it was in 2008 was when they first became certified with their first vineyards for biodynamics. This particular wine comes from the Hazel's vineyard. It's on a north-south row orientation, north-facing slope. And talking to Japo about this wine, it's really interesting how you look at soil variability even within a block, let alone within different vineyards. So it's got a lot more leaner, sort of bony, gravelly sort of soils at the top. And Japo was saying that they tend to pick this in several tranches, 3 or 4 tranches, and it's the stuff that's much leaner at the top that they isolate, and they'll ferment this in concrete. And I think for me, it's one of the wines that's got this really ethereal prettiness about this wine, probably a function of the very cool 2017 vintage, but really, really gentle handling with whole berries going into the non-block, the concrete fermenters. no temperature control, just maintains that sort of 24, 26 degrees. Just a very, very thoughtful, respectful sort of approach to the winemaking there with that obviously with the biodynamic practices in the vineyard. While they're using the 500 and 501 as part of their viticultural growing program, and respecting fruit days and flower days and so on. They take quite a pragmatic approach to, particularly around vintage and harvest and forecasting and basically just picking it on what they feel is the optimal day.
Yeah, great stuff. Jimmy, could you introduce wine number 5, which is the Cape Mentelle?
Yes, no problem. So, we heard Jamie, you say about Cape Mentelle being one of the early pioneers. So established in 1970, as Glenn also said, by David Hohnen, who was a pretty important person in the development of the region, being one of the first wine-educated winemakers, doing uni in Davis prior to 1970. In terms of this one, it's the 2017 vintage again, so similar to the McHenry Hohnen one. Fruit sourced from a variety of sub-regions within Margaret River. So Willie Abrupt, their main estate and their old plantings in Wallcliffe, which they have some quite unique sites there in terms of some's under bush vines, some's east-west, some's north-south plantings. So they have some real variation within the selections and a little bit from further south. In terms of the winemaking, have an amazing fruits sorting set up there. So fruits sorted meticulously, slightly crushed, and then fermentation in a variety of vessels at Cape Mentelle, and quite an extended period on skin. So really, with the Margaret River, if we have more extraction, we kind of need to do more extended maceration just to soften and manipulate those tannins and condense those tannins and to give beautiful mouthfeel. And I think that's what you see here. It's got a really mouth-coating tannin profile on the wine, and really some lovely freshness and length through that palate. And like Glenn said, that cooler 17 vineyard exudes that sort of freshness. And in terms of Cape Mentelle's sort of vineyard and sustainability, they're very much you're making use of really cutting-edge technology in terms of sap water flow within the vines and water monitoring within the soil, and sort of GPS and photography, infrared mapping of their vineyards for some of their different applications. So,
quite cutting edge. Like all the measurement on tannins and on all this. Their picking decisions are quite incredible, and how meticulous they are. Panel by panel, vine by vine. It's next level.
Fantastic. And so, Bart, could you introduce the final wine, which is the Woodlands 2016?
Yeah, this is the only 2016 in the lineup. So Woodlands, I'm pretty good mates with Jaden, who's the viticulturalist up there. So they started their transition or conversion around about 2016 to organics. They have a very unique site, I think, in Margaret River, in the Willie Abrupt sort of valley almost. A lot of it's south-facing, but it's one of these little valleys that you just go, wow, sometimes you in that vineyard you're going, I could be in Europe or New Zealand or somewhere. But they've, I think one of the things that they've done, which I've watched them do, is, they were established in 1973, I think. Mm-hmm. So one of the early comers. So they've got their fair, their old vines on their property, as we do, as you do, and our vines in Margaret River are getting older. But they've put a real emphasis on pruning, and that's their way of sort of dealing with their sustainability, is to prune the vines in a way that is sympathetic to the vine and encourages sap flow and tries to get some more longevity out of the vine. I think we all agree as viticulturalists in Margaret River, when we went to university and were taught how to prune a vine, we were showed to prune a vine the way you want it to look, which was sometimes in conflict with what was best for the vine. I always say that an arborist probably knew better how to prune a vine than us, you know.
Yeah.
So now that we've been made aware of that and we know what to do, I think we're seeing changes. You know, we're seeing old vines sort of rally a bit and come back to life. But Jaden has really driven that at Woodlands, I think. He's really passionate about it. And I think that's one of the sort of, if you were to say, you know, viticulturally, besides organics, what are Woodlands doing? I would say they're embracing this sap flow pruning, and they're doing it really well.
Well, they had one of the first workshops up there, I think it was, back in the day. And it's like, so from one of the founding vineyards who've got a long history there, they're sort of leading the charge with stuff like that, the sympathetic pruning. And for most of us, who, as Bart was saying, you know, it's a penny drop moment, and you go, oh my God, that's so obvious.
Yeah, put the chainsaw away.
So I guess they're leading the charge in that respect, and they're really sort of being some of the older vines in the region. It's good for the rest of us to see how to deal with these older vines and the productivity of these vines, and being really, really respectful of these vines. And I think it shows through in the wine. You know, most of these wines are from sort of central Margaret River, the Vasse and the Woodlands being from Williabra. But again, there's oodles of power, but it's still so elegant. But one thing I love about this one is just the plushness of the tannin structure. Okay, older wine, but just real silky.
Well, I'm aware of the time, and our conversation, it feels like we could really go on for a lot longer, but unfortunately we've got to 11, and that means we've done an hour. And I'm also aware that a lot of people asked some questions in the Q&A, which we haven't addressed. We'll make an effort to get those answered for you, but to respect the time of all the people who've logged in, I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. So with that, I'd like to thank our three fantastic participants. It's been really good to listen to you. I feel like I've learned quite a lot about the region. It seems to be a region where there's a dynamic movement. You know, people are collegiate, you know, working together. The region may be 50 years old, as you say. It sounds like a long time, but in viticultural terms, it's not. And it sounds like that now is an exciting, dynamic time. And the wines, I think, are beautiful as well. Really enjoyed doing this. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for listening and participating.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you, Dan.
And thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Enjoy.
Cheers.
Enjoy those wines.
Sure.